A little girl arrives at the mansion of the wealthiest man in town and says, "You're the one my mother told me to find." When he discovers the reason, he's left speechless and everyone begins to cry. The doorbell rang at 9 in the evening. Richard Calloway frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He set his glass of whiskey on the coffee table and walked across the marble floor of the entrance hall. His reflection multiplied in the mirrors adorning the walls, revealing a tall 50-year-old man with grey hair at the temples and impeccable posture in his Italian suit. The doorbell rang again, more insistently. Richard hated surprises. They rarely brought good news. In his experience as CEO of Calloway Enterprises, the unexpected meant problems. He turned the doorknob and opened the door. No one. Richard looked to both sides, confused. The mansion's garden was silent and dark, lit only by the ornamental lampposts lining the circular driveway. Then he lowered his gaze. A small child stared at him with large brown eyes. A girl of about 6, dark hair tied into 2 simple braids, wearing a faded red coat and holding a unicorn backpack. In her right hand, a folded piece of paper. "May I help you?" Richard asked, unable to hide the surprise in his voice. The little girl didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were examining every detail of Richard's face, as if searching for something familiar. "You're the one my mother told me to find," she finally said, her voice small but determined. A strange chill went through Richard. "Your mother? Who is your mother?" The girl held out the folded paper. "My name is Emily Hudson. My mother's name is Clara." Clara Hudson. That name hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He felt the air leave his lungs as memories flooded his mind. Clara, wavy brown hair, a radiant smile, eyes that seemed to read his soul. Clara, the summer romance that had ended abruptly 8 years ago. Clara, whom he had deliberately left behind when the company began to take off. "You're Clara's daughter." The words came out uneven. Emily nodded. "Mom's in the hospital. She's very sick and couldn't take care of me anymore." Her childish voice held a seriousness no child should ever know. "She said you could help me." Richard took the paper with trembling fingers and unfolded it. Clara's delicate, familiar handwriting covered the page. "Richard, if you're reading this, it means Emily found you. I know it's a shock, and I'm so sorry for that. I never wanted to show up in your life this way, but I have no choice. I have terminal cancer. The doctors have given me weeks, maybe days. Emily has no one but you. I know it's unfair to ask this after so long, but she is your daughter, Richard. Look at her and you'll see. Please, don't abandon her like you did me. Clara." The last words looked blurred, as if tears had fallen on the paper. Richard lifted his gaze from the note and studied the girl's face. How had he not noticed before? The shape of her chin, the crease between her eyebrows. They were identical to his. "Come in," he said, stepping aside, his mind still processing the impact of the revelation. Emily entered timidly, her footsteps almost inaudible on the cold floor. She looked around, her eyes wide at the size and grandeur of the foyer. "Your house is pretty," she murmured, clutching her backpack to her chest. Richard closed the door, trying to organize his thoughts. He needed to call his lawyer, verify all this, find out which hospital Clara was in. But the little girl in front of him, huddled and tired, needed immediate attention. "Are you hungry?" he asked, surprising even himself with the question. Emily nodded. "I haven't eaten since lunchtime. The social worker brought me straight from the hospital." "Social worker?" "She dropped me off at the gate. She said I should ring the doorbell and give you the note," Emily explained as if it were the most normal procedure. "She's waiting in the car, out there." Richard walked to the window and saw a black car parked across the street. Someone watched the mansion from the driver's seat. He turned back to Emily, who was now looking at the floor. "I need a home," she said quietly, the words coming out as a whisper. "Mom said you might be my dad." The simplicity of that statement hit Richard like no other. In his 50 years, no one had ever needed him in that way. People wanted his money, his influence, his power, but never just him. "Let's talk in the kitchen," Richard said, guiding her down the hallway. I have sandwiches and milk. Then I'll call to speak with your mother. Emily followed in silence. In the brighter light of the stainless steel kitchen, Richard could see the dark circles under the girl's eyes and the tear stains on her cheeks. While opening the fridge, he glanced at Emily, who settled on a tall stool by the kitchen island. She placed her backpack beside her and pulled a worn teddy bear from the side pocket. "This is Mr. Buttons," she explained, noticing Richard's look. "He's sad too, because Mom is sick." Richard felt something strange tighten in his chest. He placed the milk and sandwich ingredients on the counter, trying to ignore the feeling. He had built an empire, negotiated billion-dollar deals, faced hostile board meetings, yet he had no idea how to handle a child, especially one who might be his daughter. A daughter. He had a daughter. As he prepared the sandwich, Richard watched Emily from the corner of his eye. She whispered softly to the teddy bear, talking about the huge house and the serious man who might be her dad. At that moment, looking at the small, solitary figure sitting in his pristine kitchen, Richard Calloway knew his orderly, predictable life had just ended forever. The Metropolitan Hospital was a labyrinth of white hallways and harsh lighting. Richard hated hospitals. The antiseptic smell, the muted sounds of conversations and machinery, the constant sense that life and death were vying for space. He had left Emily with his housekeeper, Mrs. Parker, a middle-aged woman who, despite her surprise, agreed to watch the girl while he handled urgent matters. He hadn't mentioned those matters involved an ex-girlfriend and the possibility he was a father. "Room 407, the receptionist informed after checking the system. "Oncology ward." Oncology. The word pressed on his chest as he walked toward the elevator. Clara had cancer, terminal according to the note. The metal doors closed, and Richard stared at his distorted reflection. He looked older than he had a few hours ago. On the 4th floor, he followed the signs until he found room 407. He hesitated in front of the slightly open door. For a moment, he considered turning back. His life was perfect as it was, organized and predictable. Clara and this child, his child, represented complications he had never planned on. "Are you going to come in or stay out there all day?" The voice, though weak, was unmistakably hers. Richard pushed the door open and entered. Clara lay on a hospital bed, her head propped on white pillows. She was thinner, far thinner than he remembered. Her face, once so full of life, now showed the sharp lines of illness. 4 tubes were attached to her arms, monitors tracking her vital signs. But her eyes, those intense brown eyes that had enchanted him 8 years ago, were the same. "Hello, Richard," she said. "How you still know how to make a dramatic entrance?" He took a few steps toward the bed, unsure what to do. "Clara, Emily found you then," she commented, adjusting herself slightly on the pillows. "I told her you lived in a big house on the hill. You always wanted to live up there, didn't you? To see the whole town at your feet." There was something in the way she spoke, no bitterness, just stating facts, that made Richard feel even worse. "Why didn't you tell me?" His words came out harsher than he intended. "About Emily. She's my daughter, isn't she?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Yes, she's your daughter." Richard pulled up a chair and sat down, his head spinning. 6 years, Clara. 6 years, and you never thought it was important to let me know I have a daughter." "And what would you have done?" she asked, her voice calm. "Back then, you were building your empire. The last thing you told me was that you didn't have space in your life for distractions, that you needed to focus." His own words came back to haunt him. He really had said that on their last night together. Clara had mentioned wanting something more serious, maybe starting a family someday, and he had completely dismissed the idea. "I had the right to know," he insisted more quietly. "Maybe." Clara nodded slightly. "But Emily had the right to grow up without feeling like a burden to her father." Silence fell between them. Outside in the hallway, doctors and nurses walked by, the hospital's routine unshaken. "I never wanted to interfere in your life, Richard," Clara continued after a moment. I managed to raise Emily on my own. She's a wonderful girl, smart, strong, stubborn like you." A small smile appeared on her pale lips. "But now, how long?" Richard asked, looking at the monitors, unable to meet Clara's eyes directly. "Weeks, maybe less." Clara took a deep breath, a painful effort. "I tried every treatment. They worked for a while, but the cancer came back aggressively. Now it's just waiting." Richard felt something hot and wet on his cheeks. He touched his face, surprised to find he was crying. He couldn't remember the last time he had cried, perhaps at his father's funeral, more than 20 years ago. "Why now, Clara? Why come to me now?" Clara held out her hand, frail and pale, and Richard took it instinctively. Her skin felt cold. "Because Emily will need someone when I'm gone. She has no one else, Richard. My parents passed away. I have no siblings. The few close friends I have can't take on a child." "And you thought I could," he whispered. "Clara, I don't know how to be a father. I barely know how to talk to a child." Clara squeezed his hand gently. "Because I knew you weren't ready to be a father, but now Emily needs you." Something in those simple words hit him deeply. It wasn't about being ready. It was about need, the need of a child who hadn't asked to be born, who hadn't asked to lose her mother. "I should be mad at you," Richard said, wiping the tears with his suit sleeve, "for hiding this from me for so long." "You have every right to be," Clara agreed, "but don't let that anger affect how you see Emily. She's not responsible for the decisions we made." Richard nodded slowly. "What do I do now?" "Spend time with her," Clara suggested. "Get to know your daughter. She's extraordinary, Richard. Then decide. I know I'm asking a lot, but I need to know she'll have a home when I'm gone." The reality of the situation sank in. Clara was dying. Emily would be left without a mother, and he had to decide whether to take responsibility for a child he barely knew. "What if I can't?" he asked, voice trembling. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, there was determination in them. "Then help find a good family for her, someone who will love her and take care of her as she deserves." She hesitated. "But please, give yourselves a chance, Richard." A nurse entered the room, interrupting. "Time for your medication, Mrs. Hudson, and visiting hours are almost over." Richard stood reluctantly. "I'll come back tomorrow," he promised, uncertain if that was what Clara wanted. She nodded, her gaze conveying more than words could. "Emily likes bedtime stories, and she's afraid of the dark. Leave a small light on." They were practical details, things a father should know. Richard stored them in his mind, feeling the weight of his new responsibility. "Take care, Clara," he said, stepping away from the bed. "Richard," she called when he was almost at the door. "Thank you for coming." He left the room without responding, a knot in his throat preventing any words. In the hospital corridor, he leaned against the wall, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. His world had crumbled in less than 24 hours. Stepping out into the chilly night, Richard Calloway carried more than just the weight of his own secrets and decisions. He carried the future of a child, his child, and had no idea what to do next. Richard stared at the ceiling of his bedroom, lying in a king-size bed that now felt far too big. The digital clock on the nightstand read 5:17 a.m. He hadn't managed more than 3 hours of sleep. His mind crowded with thoughts of Clara dying in a hospital bed and of the little girl sleeping in the guest room across the hall. His daughter. The word still sounded strange in his mind. He got up, knowing he wouldn't fall back asleep. He put on a robe over his pajamas and walked quietly down the hall. He stopped in front of the door where Emily slept, hesitating. He opened it a crack, just enough to see the small shape under the covers. Emily slept clutching the worn teddy bear, her face serene, unaware of the chaos her arrival had brought to Richard's life. He closed the door and went down to the kitchen, where he made strong coffee. 2 hours later, he heard light footsteps on the stairs. Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in pajamas, her hair messy, holding the teddy bear firmly in one hand. "Good morning," she said, rubbing her eyes. "Can I have some milk?" "Of course," Richard replied awkwardly, standing up. He poured her a glass of milk, feeling strangely formal. "Did you sleep well?" Emily nodded, sitting down at the kitchen table. "The bed is big and soft, but I left the lamp on. Is that okay?" "That's fine," he assured her. There was an awkward silence. Richard had never felt so uneasy in his own home. "Do you want cereal?" "Sure." Emily looked around the kitchen. "Your house is so clean. It looks like a house from a magazine." Richard gave a slight smile. "Mrs. Parker keeps everything in order." "Who's Mrs. Parker?" "My housekeeper. She comes every day except Sundays." Emily sipped her milk, leaving a white line above her lips. "Our house is small. It only has 2 bedrooms and a living room, but Mom lets me draw on the fridge." She paused. "Can I draw on your fridge?" The question caught Richard off guard. Maybe we can find some paper for you to draw on." "Okay." Emily shrugged, now looking at the kitchen window that opened onto the garden. "You have a pool. Can I swim in it?" "I'm not sure," Richard began, but stopped. What could he say? That it wasn't safe? That he didn't want to be bothered? That he was afraid she'd drown? "Maybe later. First you need breakfast." After breakfast, Emily asked to explore the house. Richard agreed, keeping his distance as she wandered from room to room. He noticed how she looked at everything with wonder, especially the artwork and expensive decorative items. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to a modern sculpture in the foyer. "Contemporary art," Richard answered, realizing how pretentious it sounded immediately. Emily tilted her head. "Looks like giant spaghetti." Richard couldn't help but smile. "You know, I've always thought the same thing." The morning passed with Emily exploring every corner of the mansion, asking endless questions. For Richard, who had lived in silence for years, the child's constant curiosity was both exhausting and strangely refreshing. "How many bedrooms are there?" "7. "Why? Do you have a lot of guests?" "Actually, no." "Then why do you need so many bedrooms?" Richard had no answer. He had never questioned the need for so much space for just one person. It was simply what people at his level bought, mansions with too many rooms and empty hallways. Early in the afternoon, he had to make some work calls. He asked Mrs. Parker to keep an eye on Emily, but the girl insisted on staying close to him. She sat quietly on the office couch with a few books Richard found in the library, books he hadn't realized he owned. He tried to focus on work, but his attention kept drifting to the small figure on the couch, now flipping through an illustrated book, moving her lips as she tried to read some words. "Do you work all the time?" she asked, catching him watching her. "Most of the time, yes. Mom works a lot too. She's a nurse, or she was before she got sick." Emily closed the book. "Are you going to see her today? Can I come?" Richard hesitated. "Yes, we'll go later. Right now, I need to finish these calls." The truth was he'd been putting off returning to the hospital. Every minute spent with Emily made it more real that soon she would be his full responsibility. The thought terrified him. The next morning, Richard woke to noises coming from the kitchen. Alarmed, he hurried downstairs, thinking an intruder might have broken in. Instead, he found Emily standing on a stool by the stove, surrounded by an impressive mess. Eggs broken on the floor, flour scattered over the counter, a puddle of spilled milk, and a smell of something burning. "What are you doing?" he asked, astonished. Emily turned around, her face smeared with flour and a radiant smile. "Surprise! I'm making pancakes for you, like Mom does on special days." Richard surveyed the scene, the pristine kitchen now a culinary disaster zone. Emily held a spatula too large for her small hands, trying to flip something unrecognizable in the pan. "It's almost done," she assured him. "I just wasn't sure if I was supposed to put the eggshell in or not." Richard didn't know how to react at first. His initial impulse was annoyance, the mess, the waste, the invasion of his neat space. But then he saw the hopeful look in Emily's eyes, the way she'd tried so hard to do something special for him. "Let me help," he said, surprising himself. He moved closer and took the spatula. Pancakes can be tricky. Maybe we should start with something simpler. You're not mad, she asked, biting her lip. No, he replied, realizing it was true. But next time, tell me before using the stove, okay? It can be dangerous. Together, they cleaned up the mess and made a simple breakfast. Richard showed Emily how to crack eggs properly and measure ingredients. It was the first time he'd cooked with anyone since Clara, years ago. While they ate, Richard watched Emily devour her scrambled eggs enthusiastically. Why do you live alone in such a big house? She asked suddenly. The question, innocent and direct as only a child can ask, caught Richard off guard. I like having space, he replied, realizing how empty it sounded. Emily chewed thoughtfully. But isn't it sad? Mum says people shouldn't be alone. That's why we have neighbors and friends. Richard didn't know how to respond. Instead, he gathered the empty plates and took them to the sink. Let's get dressed, he said. We're going to see your mom today. Remember? Emily nodded happily, hopping down from her chair. Before leaving the kitchen, she stopped and looked at Richard. Thanks for helping me with breakfast. That was fun. It was such a simple comment, but it affected Richard in an unexpected way. When was the last time anyone had found his company fun? When was the last time he'd had fun doing something so simple as making breakfast? As Emily ran off to get dressed, Richard remained in the kitchen, reflecting on how a 6-year-old was slowly finding cracks in a wall he'd spent decades building. Richard sat on the back patio of his mansion, watching Emily play in the garden. Mrs. Parker had found an old ball in storage, and now the girl ran across the perfectly manicured lawn, chasing it with the boundless energy only children have. A week had passed since Emily had shown up at his door. A week of daily hospital visits, quiet dinners and small discoveries about his daughter, like the fact that she hated carrots, loved adventure stories, and talked to her teddy bear as if it were a real person. Richard sipped his whiskey, letting his mind drift to the past. 8 years earlier, when he met Clara, she had been working at the university hospital where Richard was admitted after a collapse from exhaustion. At the time, he was busy turning the mid-sized company he had inherited from his father into an international conglomerate, 18-hour workdays, 7 days a week. Clara was the nurse on the night shift. You need to learn to slow down, she had said, checking his vitals. Otherwise, you'll be back here with something worse than exhaustion. He recalled feeling irritated by her directness. People usually didn't confront him, but Clara Hudson wasn't intimidated by titles or bank balances. She treated him as she would any other patient, with professional firmness and genuine compassion. On the third night of his hospital stay, they talked for hours. Clara had finished her shift but stopped by his room before leaving. Richard learned she had majored in literature before becoming a nurse, that she loved old jazz, and that her laughter seemed to light up the entire room. When he was discharged, he asked her out to dinner. To his surprise, she declined. I don't date my patients, she explained. It's a rule of mine. What about ex-patients? He asked, with a smile he rarely showed. Clara considered it for a moment. Call me in 2 weeks. If you still want to take me to dinner, we'll talk. He called exactly 2 weeks later, and 2 weeks after that, he took her to the best restaurant in town. But Clara seemed uncomfortable with the formal setting and the exorbitant prices. On their second date, she picked the venue, a small jazz club downtown where the musicians played just a few feet from the tables. The summer passed like a dream. Clara made him laugh, challenged him, pulled him out of his comfort zone. With her, Richard was not the CEO of Callaway Enterprises, not the business mogul featured in financial magazines. He was simply Richard, a man discovering at 42 that perhaps there was more to life than quarterly reports and corporate takeovers. But then autumn arrived, along with a business opportunity that required all his attention, a merger that could triple the company's value. Clara began to notice the missed calls, the last-minute cancelled dinners, the distant look in Richard's eyes even when they were together. "You're always somewhere else," she said one October evening, as he checked his email for the 5th time during dinner. "Physically here, but mentally there." Richard put his phone aside. "It's temporary. The merger is at a critical stage. Everything in your life is temporary, Richard, except your work." She didn't speak angrily. She merely sounded resigned, as if she had finally accepted a truth she had been trying to deny. A week later, Clara spoke about the future. Maybe marriage someday, maybe children. That was when Richard said the words that now haunted him. "I don't have room in my life for distractions right now. I need to focus on what's important." The look on Clara's face that night, the way her smile vanished, how her eyes lost their shine, was etched into his memory. "I see," she said, rising from the table. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Richard. I truly do." That was the last time he saw her, until now. "Richard, you seem far away." The voice of Jonathan's, his personal assistant for over 10 years, brought him back to the present. The younger man had just arrived, carrying a folder of documents. Richard nodded toward the chair beside him. "Just remembering a few things." Jonathan sat down, throwing a quick glance at Emily in the garden. "The results are in," he said, handing Richard an envelope. Richard took the envelope but didn't open it immediately. 3 days ago, at his lawyer's urging, he had requested a DNA test, a formality, the lawyer insisted, necessary for establishing paternity legally, in case the worst happened. "Do you want me to step out?" Jonathan asked, noticing his hesitation. "No." Richard opened the envelope and took out the official paper. His eyes scanned the medical jargon until they found the result. The probability of paternity was 99.98%. Emily was, without a doubt, his biological daughter. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, letting the information settle. He already knew, of course. He only had to look at Emily to see the similarities, not just physical, but the way she furrowed her brow when focused, the slight tilt of her head when intrigued. "Is it the expected result?" Jonathan asked carefully. "Yes." Richard put the paper back in the envelope. "She's my daughter." Jonathan nodded, unsurprised. He knew Richard well enough to expect him to take responsibility. "The lawyer is preparing the guardianship documents," Jonathan continued. "Given Ms. Hudson's condition, the process will be expedited. But," he hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "But what?" "He mentioned that you have options. The law doesn't force a father to take custody if he doesn't feel prepared. There are alternatives." Richard looked at Emily, who was now lying on the grass and staring at the clouds. "What sort of alternatives?" "Well, Ms. Hudson listed an aunt in her medical records, someone named Margaret Fisher, who lives in Seattle. They're not close, and from what I understand, but she is a relative. The lawyer suggested that if you prefer, we can contact her." The idea of sending Emily to live with a distant aunt she barely knew squeezed Richard's chest. An Aunt Clara hadn't considered close enough to be her first option. "Or there's the adoption system," Jonathan continued, his professional tone contrasting with the delicate subject. "Young children like Emily are usually adopted quickly, especially since she's, well, healthy and without behavioral issues." Richard raised his hand, stopping him. The thought of Emily in the foster care system, waiting for strangers to take her in, was unbearable. "Just prepare the guardianship papers," he said, more brusquely than intended. Jonathan nodded, putting away the documents. "Richard," he said, hesitant, "may I speak frankly?" "When do you not?" A small smile appeared on the assistant's face. "I've known you for over a decade. I've seen you build an empire. You've closed deals others thought impossible. But you're not sure I can take care of a child," Richard finished. "That's not it," Jonathan corrected. "It's that you've always prioritized things you can measure and control. Spreadsheets, profit margins, stocks, things you can maneuver with your brilliant mind." He paused. "A child isn't like that. There's no manual, no guaranteed strategy." Richard watched Emily, who was now standing and running after a butterfly. "I'm aware," he said. "Maybe that's exactly why I'm hesitant." "Hesitant or afraid?" Richard shot Jonathan a sharp look. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by employees, but Jonathan occupied a peculiar role somewhere between assistant and confidant. If anyone could speak truth to Richard Calloway, it was him. "Both," Richard admitted. "I don't know how to be a father. I never wanted to be a father." "With all due respect, sir, I think the real problem isn't that," Jonathan said, leaning slightly forward. "The problem is that you're afraid of failure. In your life, you've only allowed yourself to do things you were sure you'd excel at, carefully calculating every risk." The words hit Richard hard. It was true. He had built his life and career by choosing battles he knew he could win, calculating every move meticulously. "What if I fail her?" he whispered. "If I'm not the father she needs?" Jonathan offered a small smile. "This might be the first time you have something more precious than money, something you can't control with business strategies. And that's terrifying." Richard studied his assistant, surprised by the insight. It was exactly that. Emily represented a type of risk he'd never faced before, the risk of loving someone unconditionally and still failing. "She looks like her mother," Richard commented, watching Emily, who was now approaching with something in her hands. "I'd say she has a lot of you, too," Jonathan replied, standing up. The same determination in her eyes. Emily arrived, cupping her hands. "Look what I found," she exclaimed, opening them to reveal a small ladybug. "Can I keep it?" Richard exchanged glances with Jonathan. "Wild creatures should stay in nature, Emily. But we can build a little house for it in the garden, if you like." Emily's eyes lit up. "Really?" "Sure, Jonathan can help us find the materials." Richard stood. "Go put the ladybug back in the grass, and then we can start." As Emily ran back to the garden, Jonathan turned to Richard. "For someone who doesn't know how to be a father, you seem to be doing just fine," he observed. "It was just a simple answer about a ladybug," Richard said, looking away. "That's how it begins," Jonathan replied, with a knowing smile. "Small answers to small questions, small decisions that eventually become big ones." After Jonathan left, Richard returned to his office. There was work piling up, emails unanswered, calls to return. But instead of opening his laptop, he found himself at the window, watching Emily in the garden, now helping Mrs. Parker pick flowers. He picked up the DNA test results, reading them again. The clinical, precise language confirmed what his heart already knew. Emily was his daughter, his blood, his responsibility. Richard remembered his own father, a distant man, always busy, rarely present at important events. A man who showed love by providing material comforts, but never time or attention. Richard had vowed to be different if he ever had children. Then he decided never to have them, avoiding the risk of becoming like his father. But now fate was giving him a choice. He could send Emily to live with a distant aunt, a stranger who shared only Clara's last name. He could justify it as being best for the girl, growing up in a real family, with someone who knew how to care for children. Or he could try. He could face his fear of failure, his fear of repeating his father's mistakes. He could give Emily a home, not just a big, luxurious house, but a true home. Richard put the test results in his drawer and looked at the photo on his desk, a framed picture of him receiving a Business Person of the Year award 2 years prior. In the photo, he wore the practiced smile he reserved for public occasions, holding a crystal trophy that now collected dust on some shelf. Next to that formal photo, there was now a brightly colored, crooked drawing Emily had made the previous night. "Me and you," read the childlike handwriting, showing 2 stick figures, one large, one small, holding hands. Richard ran his fingertips over the drawing, feeling an unnamed emotion. In the garden, Emily laughed at something Mrs. Parker said. Her laughter drifted through the open window, light, clear, unburdened. So much like Clara's laugh. Maybe Jonathan was right. Maybe, for the first time in his life, Richard Calloway had found something truly precious, Something money couldn't buy or power couldn't control. Something that required not his sharp mind or fierce determination, but his heart. Something more valuable than money. The unmistakable smell of hospital antiseptic filled Richard's nostrils as soon as the automatic doors opened. Emily gripped his hand tightly, hugging her teddy bear to her chest with the other arm. She wore a blue dress Mrs. Parker had bought the day before, and her hair was tied in a simple braid. "Remember what we talked about?" Richard asked, lowering himself to her eye level. Emily nodded. "That Mom is very weak and needs peace and quiet." "That's right. And we can't stay long because she needs to rest." The girl looked down the white hallway, her small face suddenly serious. "She's going to get better, isn't she?" Richard felt a lump in his throat. The doctors had been clear on the last visit. Clara was deteriorating rapidly. The cancer had spread to her liver, and her body was no longer responding to treatments. It was a matter of days, maybe a week. "Let's hope so," he said, unable to lie outright but also lacking the courage to tell the whole truth. In the elevator, Emily was quiet, shifting slightly on her heels. Since Richard brought her to his home 2 weeks ago, she'd asked about her mother every day. Even with frequent hospital visits, Emily missed Clara intensely. Richard wondered what would happen to her when Clara was gone. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that her mother would never come home? How do you comfort her through a grief he himself had never truly experienced? The door to room 407 was ajar. Richard knocked softly before entering, Emily almost hiding behind him. "Clara, can we come in?" A weak voice answered from inside. "Sure, come in." Richard pushed the door open, and the antiseptic smell grew stronger. Clara was lying in the hospital bed, even thinner than the week before. Her face had taken on a yellowish tone, and although her eyes were still alert, they were sunken in deep circles. An IV bag was connected to her arm, monitors beeping at an irregular pace that hardly felt comforting. "Hi," Clara said, trying to smile. Her gaze shifted past Richard and landed on Emily, who remained partly hidden behind him. "Hey, Princess." "Mom." Emily let go of Richard's hand and ran to the bed, stopping only when the nurse made a discreet gesture. "Watch the tubes, sweetie," the nurse said gently. "You can hug your mum, but be careful." Emily nodded solemnly and approached the bed with measured steps. Clara opened her arms, and the girl leaned in for a careful hug. "I've missed you so much," Clara murmured, kissing the top of Emily's head. "Me too, Mom. Why can't you just get better so we can go home?" Clara glanced at Richard, who stepped closer to the bed. "The nurse will get you a stool to sit on, Emily," he said, "so you can stay close to your mum." The nurse nodded and left the room, returning moments later with a small stool that she placed beside the bed. Emily climbed onto it, placing Mr. Buttons on the covers. "I brought Mr. Buttons to keep you company," Emily explained. "He missed you too." Clara smiled and touched the worn teddy bear. "Thank you, sweetie. He'll help me feel better." Richard stepped back a bit, giving mother and daughter some space. Clara listened attentively as Emily talked about the new house, the big garden, the pool she still hadn't used, and how Mrs. Parker made really good pancakes, but not as good as hers. "Is Richard nice?" Clara asked, glancing briefly at him. Emily thought for a second. "He's quiet, but he helped me build a house for a ladybug in the garden, and he didn't get mad when I spilled juice on the rug." Clara laughed softly, though it seemed to cost her effort. "That's good." Richard noticed how different she was from the vibrant woman he had known years ago. The illness had stolen not only her health, but also that lively energy she once radiated. Still, when Clara looked at Emily, her eyes regained some of their old glow. After about 20 minutes of conversation, Clara began to show signs of exhaustion. Her breathing grew heavier, and she closed her eyes for a few moments. "Emily," Richard said, "how about going to the cafeteria to buy some juice? Your mother and I need to talk for a bit." The girl looked uncertainly from Richard to Clara. "It's all right," Clara assured her. "Come back in a few minutes with your juice, and we'll finish our talk." Emily agreed reluctantly. Richard called a nurse's aide in the hallway, and asked her to escort the girl to the cafeteria. When they were alone, he moved closer to the bed. "How are you feeling?" he asked, knowing it was a silly question but not sure what else to say. "I've been better," Clara answered, with a ghost of her old sarcasm. "The doctors are kind, but I know my time is running out." Richard sat in the chair beside her bed. "Don't say that. We have to be realistic, Richard, for Emily." Clara paused, breathing with difficulty. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" He knew exactly what she meant. "Yes, I'll take care of her." Clara's face lit up with relief and hope. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel obligated." "It's not an obligation," he replied.